Hey, good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Wow. Thank you. I do have a friend in the back there. My name is Jennifer Randall, and I am currently the Director of Civic Engagement at the University of East London. I've been in that job for 2 months, so I'm very, very new to that. But it's a real pleasure for me to be here today, and I'm standing in for my boss, Nora Colton. But I'm here today to chair this panel with these lovely speakers that we have. I met Arun a few hours ago and met these people a few minutes ago, but I think you've had the afternoon, and I hope that you've had a good time here today and learned a lot. To my left, we have Mr. Dan Robertson, who is the Diversity and Inclusion Director for the Employers Network for Equality and Inclusion. Then we have Paul Deemer, who is the head of Equality, Diversity, and Human Rights, and expert in the public sector. To my left, I have Alice Streatfeild, who is the Associate Director of ORC International and is our statistics guru sitting up here today. And to my right is Arun Batra, who is the Chief Executive of the National Equality Standard and a director at EY. So if we could just welcome them to the panel today. We have all been told that we are here to talk about equality and diversity in the context and after Cameron. And I have been reading about a speech that Cameron gave in July this year in which he made it quite clear about transparency around the gender gap and what implications that would have for business. It seems that this is high on the agenda, and the 4 people sitting in front of you today are here to reflect on that. So what we're going to do is each of these people will speak for a few moments, and then we'll open it up to you for some questions. Okay? If we can start over here with Paul, would that be okay?
Thank you, yeah. It's interesting, as you said, July. I didn't realise that, because I thought this was because he also made a similar statement at the conference, Conservative conference this year, didn't he? He addressed some equalities issues, which I was quite surprised at, actually. And the interesting thing for me when both in this July speech, actually, this is talking about the gender pay gap, but also the references that he made at conference. They were very sort of personalised comments, and I thought that was quite brave of him. So he brought it down to a very individual level. So he talks about, his own family, being a father, having children, and the expectations he's got for them and stuff like that, which I know he does quite a lot, but to then put it into an equality context is quite interesting. For me as well, and this is giving my age away, I suspect, it also, that sort of resonated with me with the sort of Margaret Thatcher thing. So, Margaret Thatcher's always remembered for that, making that reference to the economy, to the household income. So bringing it back home, making it very real for people. And I thought that was quite, that's the same way I think Cameron's done that as well. So he's made it very personal. He's made people think about diversity, think about equality on a very personal level. And I thought that was quite interesting. I thought it was quite challenging. And I think that it will be interesting to see how that plays out. I'm not sure whether it works particularly well when you're talking about the gender pay gap, because obviously the gender pay gap is a gap that's been there for too many years now. And I do wonder whether, and we'll probably get on to talk about this in perhaps a bit more detail, whether there's a step change needed around the gender pay gap, perhaps. And I know that's some of the things that are trying to be done through the Davis report, etc. I know there are some people here from the private sector. So there are some attempts to do that, but I do think that there's more momentum needed, I think, behind. I think the targets that have been set so far by Lord Davis are good. Don't think they're overly ambitious, should we say, and I think perhaps they need to be more ambitious. But perhaps we can go on and talk about that later on. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Can we move on to Dan?
Yeah, I haven't got a great deal of reflection, actually, in terms of what Cameron said. I guess you've got 2 responses, right? One could be about time. The other response could be, actually, it's quite a good thing that he's now, encouraging businesses with, 250 employees to do the gender pay. I mean, I'm kind of on the, let's encourage and support business side to do that. So I think it's good. I think actually some of his analysis was quite sophisticated. It's not just a case of having, a male and female in the same role, and therefore these days women are getting paid less. It's much more complex than that in terms of actually the types of roles that women end up doing. So actually what Cameron was doing was focusing more on those kind of like structural barriers and some of the unconscious biases which prevent women from reaching certain positions. So I thought that was quite reflective actually, I guess, in his speech. I actually noticed, like Paul did actually, the personalisation, and he talked quite a lot about disability, and that's clearly a reference to his child. I think there's a problem with that actually, and I think one of the problems of personalising things is we know through psychology is that we're just naturally going to connect with people that are like us. We're going to have this intense relationship with people who look like us and sound like us and all of that. But actually, I think if we're going to be sophisticated about moving the inclusion agenda forward, we have to look at data and analysis. So, for example, when you look at data of black and ethnic minority populations, and you compare that data to who gets what in terms of management positions, and what is the state of play of black and ethnic minority executives and managers. When you look at that data and compare it to UK populations in the UK, it's actually quite shocking. So I would say, of course, we need to have empathy and personalisation, but I think actually our decision-making process from an inclusion perspective really needs to be based on data and statistics and driving the data to help us inform our decision-making. So I guess they were just my reflections in terms of what his speech was about.
Great, thank you.
So I suppose first of all I want to say is that yes, I've got some numbers, but I am not an academic, okay? I like stories, I like numbers, but I essentially am more of an observer. I also am not a practitioner. My role is largely looking at helping organisations understand what their employees think. And it means I'm quite privy and quite a privileged position in terms of understanding some of the survey data that we see. I'd actually almost counteract the point there in terms of stories or, stories, yes, we do recognise ourselves as stories. Humans like stories. I think it goes back to childhood when we're being told stories about Big Bad Wolf or, those monsters. Unfortunately, life isn't black and white. It isn't a binary. There are so many complexities. And I think that really comes out when we're looking about the gender pay gap. I'm going to cite a couple of numbers. I'm not going to talk about standard deviation or statistical significance. I say this a word every day and I can still never get it out of my mouth. Just a few facts and figures. So in terms of, we run, the organisation I work for, we run about 300 odd surveys across the UK each year, and we have approximately 800,000 data points to sort of give you a rough idea about the base size. In terms of pay, we ask women who feel that their pay is fair considering their duties and responsibilities. Now, pay isn't something which people typically are positive about. So 58% of women feel their pay is fair versus 50% of men. So we see the gender pay gap being talked about, but actually women tend to be more favourable and feel more positive about their pay than men do. They're also much more likely to feel that their pay is reasonable. They're also much more likely to feel that their benefits are suitable. Now, we've got to think about the benefits packages which people have. They're quite often, a lot of companies will talk about maternity pay, childcare arrangement, childcare vouchers. They don't necessarily talk about other elements of supporting diversity and inclusion, for example, about adult social care, different sort of forms of support. They are also, in terms of those who are familiar with the term of engagement, women are typically more engaged. So in the face of it, women are, like men, but cheaper. However, and I hate that phrase, it's something which really gets me really annoyed. But actually, when we look within the data, we see more of the complexity. So women are more likely to feel subject to bullying, but when they are bullied, they're less likely to feel able to speak up about it. Men feel more valued. They are more likely to, if they have an idea, their manager will listen to it, okay? Also, in terms of change, so every organisation I talk to says, oh, we're going through so much change. You wouldn't believe it. Every organisation is going through change. The whole society is evolving. But when we look at change management, we know if people are allowed to be a part of it rather than subject to it, then we're much more likely to see the impact of a much better change programme. Now, we're talking about change. When we're talking to men and women about this, men are much more likely to be told the reasons behind change, so they are being included in the conversations, but also they are much more likely to be asked their opinions about how they can make the change better. So they're actually being change champions rather than change subjects. Men are much more likely to also feel safe to speak up and confident. And actually, we're just seeing so many different biases and unconscious biases within there. But it really isn't just a case that this is a status quo. I think there's a lot of work, and we've had a lot of work today, all about the different things which, whether it's government agencies, employers, or individuals setting up grassroots networks, are trying to overcome these challenges. But unfortunately, there is no magic wand. And I don't think 30 hours of free childcare is going to solve the issue, nor is conversations all about how their privileged white background is the same as someone who has come from a very stressful, challenging background, has had the same opportunities. I think it's a very complex issue. But I think if we scratch beneath the surface, we can start to get some of those stories and enlighten people about how we can make a difference.
Very good. Thanks. And finally, Arun?
I don't really care what David Cameron said. I think I'll stop there. The impact is that this is a real catalyst for change. So what we have seen with it through the National Equality Standard business that I run is that suddenly this has gone from being a touchy-feely subject, as in the whole diversity subject, to one that businesses now have to care about for a mandatory reason, as in they've never had to report on pay before, but now they do. Some of you may or may not know that this was actually already in the Equality Act, so you already had to report on pay. The only difference is this is now a legal requirement. So it was a voluntary requirement before, and now it's a legal one. He did say something about the pay gap being resolved. So I don't know if you know that if you look at the gender pay gap, for new recruits, there isn't actually much of one. And what I don't want this to be is a stick to beat up business with. Because the businesses that we've spoken to are absolutely cognizant of the fact that a long time ago, unfortunately, lots of white men ran businesses. They came in, they set their own pay scales, and that's why we have a really huge gender pay gap. And that needs to be addressed, absolutely. But if you look at new recruits today and you measure them below 40 years of age, there isn't a huge gender pay gap. It's relatively small, actually. And that's a conversation that people are kind of nervous of having. That's not universal. There are cases still where there is a bit of a pay gap, but generally. The other thing that you're going to see, like we saw with the Equality Act, is this will extend itself to other protected characteristics. So this is starting off as gender. I know already that the whole ethnic minority cohort are already making loud noises saying you surely cannot have a system where this doesn't consider us as people, as will the LGBT community, as will the disabled people, and so on. So I think this is the beginning of something very positive, because now this is going to be a mandatory requirement. My biggest concern actually is the infrastructure within government. And so I don't want to offend my government colleagues, but there has been a ton of businesses that we have spoken to have gone to government asking very technical questions, and government need to be prepared to be able to deal with them. And I'm not sure that they're going to be. And if you've looked at the spending review today, equality and diversity folk and the sorts of stuff they do will be cut, and that's what happens all the time. So they're the folk that are going to be on the front line. So whether the infrastructure is in place, goodness knows, but I hope it is.
Okay, great. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that were mentioned, and it comes from one of the presentations that I saw this afternoon from Doyen, who's probably here somewhere. And I think this concept of intersectionality is something that needs to be brought into this discussion. It seems like it's an easy win for David Cameron to talk about the gender gap, when actually there are complex interactions between these domains of identity. And so I think we could be pushing this and collecting these stories and looking a bit more deeply as to what these intersecting identities create in terms of privilege and disadvantage. So that would be my reaction to what you have all talked about and my feelings about this. Can we open it up to any questions or reflections from anybody in the audience? And we do have 2 roving mics, so please wait for a mic. Thanks.
Right, thank you. It's Michael Hassel from the University of Surrey. I mean, you focused a lot on what Cameron said, but actually, what is he doing? And I mean, just think about the change in working families' tax credits. If women are in lower paid jobs, it's going to affect them more than men. And being in the university sector, we're seeing cuts to grants for disabled students. Mm-hmm. There's cuts for the disability living allowance. And they're actual things that are happening on the ground now. So I agree with Arun, it doesn't matter what Cameron says, it matters what he does.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, if we're looking at the cuts, if we're looking at the impact on whether it's domestic violence centres, whether it's grants for disabled students, whether it's actually being able to consider different perspectives before making a decision, there is a hell of a lot which is actually reducing the ability for our society to be truly inclusive. I think there were a couple of conversations I had earlier which were saying, actually, no, people have got the business case, people understand the value of it. I think only when that business case is really spelt out and they really see, if I maybe employ that person, I can see that they will be the next Stephen Hawking. Or it's trying to get across to them that they need to almost be inclusive to be all to really benefit from it. And I don't think really they've got that. I think it's more they've got the push of saying this is something we should do. I don't think there's necessarily the value, and I think the cuts are just effectively reflecting that.
Yeah. If Cameron was to look further afield, he might look to Canada, where the Prime Minister in Canada, when appointing a 50-50 cabinet, in his first press discussion with the press, they asked him a question, why have you got a 50-50 cabinet? And his answer was, well, it is 2015. As far as I'm concerned, it's 2015 in the UK as well, and perhaps Cameron should do something about his own cabinet in this country.
Would anybody like to comment on that?
Well, also, I'll let other people speak. But one of the things which was also really interesting was it wasn't just in terms of the cabinet, it wasn't just 50-50, but he also ensured that the people who were representing the voices of different people actually had expertise in that area. So you slightly didn't have the sense of someone coming in who hasn't got an idea of being a teacher or being a doctor, running the health service or the education service. So we actually went a little bit further than just saying, on the face of it, 50-50, we want them to actually be experts.
For me, picking up both those comments, we've got to all collectively now make sure that we stop the rhetoric and make sure this is engaged within what we do day to day. There is nothing more frustrating. I know a lot of people in this room will have this, if they work in the public sector especially, where you'll have these statements from up above, then you'll get back to the office and you'll say, you know, you're the one person responsible for diversity, by the way, you're being cut by half, but still make me look good wherever I am. That can't continue. That literally cannot continue. What's been fascinating about, in my journey from going to the public to the private sector, was having this perception of what it would be like working in the private sector and thinking they would chew me up and spit me out, and actually the public sector is the right place to be, and actually seeing completely the converse happening, where they treat this as a business motivator that's going to drive growth and productivity. And now we'll look at my public sector colleagues, and I feel really sorry for them, actually. I think it's, but I don't think you, as people in the organisation, should allow it to happen. I think you need to take some responsibility for them. Stop making your leaders look good.
But I guess actually just reflect on Arun's point. I think that's a really valid point. I mean, ENI, we have a whole bunch of members. Lots of our members are private sector corporations, national and global, and we have a whole bunch of public sector organisations as well. And it is quite interesting, actually, the conversations I have with my private sector stakeholders. You know, they do know the business case, actually. They understand that this is absolutely not about political correctness or anything like that. They understand that this is about talent management, and they understand that actually if they're going to really engage and innovate and, connect with their customers, they need to look after their talent and move those barriers which get in the way. Now, don't get me wrong, in the private sector, they absolutely haven't sorted this out, but they're on a journey and they're moving towards a particular perspective. In the public sector, some of it, and we're slightly generalising, but some of it is still driven by compliance, saying actually we've got, for example, the public equality duties, they're making sure that we have equality objectives and all of that. And I think, quite frankly, there could be more energy in the public sector to say, let's imagine a world where we didn't have the Equality Act, what would that world mean to you? Does it mean that you have to stop all of your activities? Well, absolutely not. It just means that you have to find different motivating points in terms of why you should drive this forward. And if you didn't have the Equality Act, does that mean that your business case is not there in the public sector? Well, of course not. It just means that you've got to think about how do you manage your talent processes and who are your customers, who are your stakeholders, in the same way that the private sector are doing now. And, you know, so even if David Cameron's not making these points anyway, we still all have a collective responsibility to kind of, you know, action some of these things anyway. So it's not up to government to move the agenda forward, even though it is up to government to help us along the way.
I have more of a statement than a question, a bit of a question as well. But I've been in the diversity world for just only 8 years, actually. But I'm bored, really bored by it, because nothing has changed. You go to the same, you know, the conferences or whatever, and everyone says the same thing. Last 2 years, it's about gender and unconscious bias. Fine, but no one does anything about it. And I just wondered, so this is my question. If certain things were to be made, have a legislation behind it, say quotas, for example, do you think that would work as opposed to, say, the 30% Club or Lord Davies' report, which was voluntary?
Yeah.
Okay. Can I respond to that first? What I would like to say is, yeah, keep holding your microphone. I don't agree, actually, and I think if I take a big picture view, if you take 15 years, 20 years, actually, there are friends of mine who are disabled, and there are friends of mine who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, and they absolutely could not be out at work. That would have a major impact in terms of their career. Now, don't get me wrong, life is not sorted, but when we go into organisations today, people are more comfortable being out, they're more comfortable declaring their disability, and they are more comfortable talking about their ethnicity. We've got a whole bunch of issues that we still need to sort out. But we have, I think it's slightly unfair to say that we haven't moved on if we take a 10, 15-year perspective, because I think that would be slightly disingenuous in terms of some of the work which is genuinely happening, actually. So I think that is important to recognise. On the quota question, I have generally been against quotas for a whole bunch of reasons, and I've always been an advocate of targets, actually. I've changed my mind. I think we do need quotas, actually, even if it's just a temporary measure, even if it's just let's have quotas for a generation. And the reason I've changed my mind is because when you look at the data and when you look at the direction of travel, even though I've just said things are moving, it's going to take too long. We can't wait. We cannot wait for my grandchildren's grandchildren at the speed we're going. That's how long it's going to take for women to get into parliament, for women to get into business and all of that. It's going to take too long. So I think we need, like, if I can use the phraseology, a quick kick up the arse to get us into gear, and then we could maybe move the quota system backwards and go back to some kind of target thing.
Yeah. I mean, I probably agree with that, actually, yeah. I think there's something about language as well. I think quotas has got a bad press over time for various reasons, and I think we need to use a different language. I mean, my sense is, as you say, Sylvana, I think things have moved, actually. I think things have changed. I think, unfortunately, the figures don't always bear that out. And from the public sector point of view, as Dan said, I mean, we've been driven by the Public Sector Equality Duty and the Equality Act and the legal compliance issue. But actually, the organisations that stand out are the organisations that go beyond that, the organisations that have got chief executives and boards who are genuinely committed to this agenda. They understand what it's all about, and they understand the link between, well, in our respect, it's a link between diversity and patient outcomes, better staff engagement, which we've now been able to evidence within the NHS. We've just issued a report recently, which has been issued by the King's Fund, which I would recommend to you. So if you want to Google it, it's called Making the Difference, Diversity and Inclusion in the NHS. It's basically a number crunch. You'll love this, Alice, yeah? It's a number crunching report, yeah? But it's got some really important messages in it. It's a long report. I'd say read the start and read the end, yeah? Skip the middle, yeah? It's full of data, which you won't... Yeah. But seriously, the start and beginning, some very key messages, not rocket science, yeah? It tells you, so there's 3 levels. It talks about 3 levels of achieving diversity: the individual, the team, and the organisational, yeah? So again, it's not rocket science, but it's about, making sure that individuals understand their responsibility, what Arun was talking about, around diversity. That team dynamic, we know within the NHS, good teams are teams that are better engaged, they're more diverse, yeah, they're more productive, they're more efficient. We've got evidence to show that, yeah? So this just proves the case. And then the organisational level, it's about that structural stuff, yeah? So I was very struck by what Alice said about, this need to change. You talked about the childcare provision. Yeah, it's not just about childcare provision. This is about men taking responsibility for childcare. And that's about organisations enabling men to take responsibility for childcare. So it's about better paternity provisions. It's about ensuring that both men and women, both carers or partners in a partnership, in a relationship, are able to take off time when children are in the family. So there is an organisational responsibility. Us as employers, us here in this room, there's a lot of powerful people here with lots of powerful jobs and responsibilities, and we need to use that power and that responsibility and build cultures and build policies and practices that enable men to contribute to that to reducing that gender pay gap, essentially.
Okay, so
If I can just, Arun wants to make one point and then we'll come back to you, if that's okay.
Just a couple of quick things then. So on you being bored, so you attended my seminar last time. There is a way to overcome that. I won't try and sell it in the room, but there is a way to overcome that, and that's what we talked about. For me, this is all a question of proportionality. Okay, that the mistake that we've made in diversity, in the world of diversity for many years, is try to apply a really broad brush approach to what is a really complex issue. And you've got to talk the language of the person who might not be receptive to what you want to say in order to try and make change. So be that trailblazer. This is mandatory in some way or other. So the public sector equality duty is a good example of that. Has the public sector changed because of it? Not really. In fact, most people in the departments wouldn't say that they now have a fantastically diverse team of people because of the PSED. So I would say, final thing on targets, because I think it's important. In business, we have targets. If we don't meet them, we're held to account. Every single year, nobody bats an eyelid by the fact that we have revenue growth targets. We know we've got to do it. We go in and do it. If we don't, we lose our jobs. It's that serious. So they kind of do work.
Okay. So I'm going to be, okay. So I concede a little bit that there has been some growth. Not growth, movement. But at the senior management level, no, not at all. And I am living proof of that. I'm not going to go through my examples, but within the last 2 years, horrific examples. One I can tell you is I lost a job because the partners found out I earned more than them. And so I was asked to leave. That's just one out of maybe 5 examples. However, I'm going to go into a more contentious area. And actually, Trevor Phillips brought it up this morning. So he said that London schools are now top of the ranks because of the diversity they represent, particularly around the Asian pupils, which is true. What's not linked to that is that when you look at the data inside people being promoted into senior management positions, and there are some professional service firms that have said we've achieved or we are achieving our targets because we now have a high number of BAMEs in positions, partnership positions. If you look at the nature of BAMEs, they're predominantly from the Asian population as opposed to across the spectrum of BAMEs. So I just wanted to raise that and ask what was your opinion on that?
Can I quickly come back on that? I have to admit, I didn't manage to get a chance to chip in about the targets or quotas. I think the targets is a better way to go because I have to admit, if I was to suddenly be a member of the board and have someone turn around and saying because you're a woman, I would find that hugely demoralising. However, targets is different because actually it's looking about the root causes. I think the root causes is really important. And actually the point that you're making there in terms of looking within the data is particularly important If we look at survey data in terms of levels of bullying, we certainly see that there is a huge difference. If you look at BAME and white British, then you'll see one picture. If you look at white populations within that, there are huge challenges of the gypsy and travelling population. They are potentially one of the most discriminated populations in the UK. But I suppose what's really interesting is actually when you look further back. So we're all here as talking either as academics or as businesses. A real work really comes either within families but also within schools. So the work which is done in terms of raising aspirations of women and diverse groups and those who are people with disabilities is trying to say actually it isn't just that you can't do this, it's saying what you can do. So I think it's a very complex issue. But I'd almost say you've got to look within the data to really understand it. Because it isn't just, it's not the same. It's the same thing that a woman, we're not all one sort of type, we don't all think the same. I don't like shoes particularly. I have to wear them, but I don't spend all my money on them. So.
Very good. We have a question here. Yeah?
Hi. Can you hear? Is it on? I'm thinking about diversity and inclusion, and I'm wanting to just notice something that is glaringly obvious to me, and it's the constitution of this panel. So when I look at this panel at a diversity conference, I see the majority men, I see minority women, I see one BME minority. And so the question that I've got really is about courage. It's about courage to disrupt patterns that already exist. And I don't know what the thinking is that's gone into the conference and the choosing of the panel. It may be that people have dropped out at the last minute, but that may be the case, I don't know. But in relation to patterns and breaking those patterns, could I ask all of the panel members, really, to tell me what is the courageous act that we need to now embark upon to break some of these patterns and to bring about the changes that we say we all sign up to?
Can I respond to that first? I'll respond to it with a question to you, though, which is, what are the assumptions that you're making about the panel members? So one assumption you're making about the panel members is, yes, we might all be white apart from Arun, but do you know who we are? And what I mean by that is, not personally, but do you know what my background is? Like, genuinely, do you know that? Let me finish. In a second, yeah. Do you know what my sexual orientation is? Do you know whether I have a disability or not? So even though we might look kind of similar, we might be hugely diverse based on protected characteristics, those core things that we all talk about, those core essential parts of who we are, and then based on other personal traits and thinking styles and stuff like that. The problem with the question is the definition of diversity itself, which falls back to, when we think about diversity, we often think about race. Obviously, we have to think about race when we're thinking about diversity because there's so many structural inequalities, which your question was alluding to. So we have to think about that. But it narrows us back to a particular issue. We have to think about diversity as race, gender, disability, sexual orientation, thinking styles, and a whole bunch of other things. So I think when we look at people who are on a panel or in different scenarios, we have to be mindful that we're not just rapidly saying, well, you guys look the same, therefore you're the same, and you're from the same backgrounds. That would be my reflection on that. Just in relation to the question about disrupting, I do think we do need to disrupt patterns of behaviour and patterns of thinking styles. And I do think we have to disrupt them by, A, being mindful. So, for example, if you take the construction of a panel, I do think there is a responsibility on conference organisations to say, who are we having on the panel? What does it look like? Because that does send a signal and a symbol out. And how can we make sure that we intervene in a natural process to make sure that we're bringing different voices in who wouldn't? So some kind of level of intervention, I think, is actually quite useful.
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
Thank you. I absolutely agree with you about diversity. We need to look much broader than the protected characteristics. If we're going to create a change, we're talking about class, we're talking about health inequalities. The list is endless. So I absolutely agree with that point. However, as a BME woman, looking at organisations, when I look up and I don't see myself represented, it is irrespective of what is hidden. I'm talking about what we see and the symbolic representation and the power of the message that sends. And I think sometimes we underestimate that power, the power which says you don't belong or you don't have a place or you're not entitled to. The power that speaks of when I know that I'm being paid less than my male counterpart. The power of some of those messages and how those messages then become normalised and then perpetuated. And I think in relation to this conference, that is a really salient issue that needs to be grappled with, because here, above anywhere else, we should not be replicating the patterns of disadvantage that we see out there. Let's try and do something new. And I'm not having a go at anybody. I'm just saying, let's try and do something fresh and new and courageous.
My question is, when I look at organisations, when I look at the executives of organisations, do they represent who I am? And the simple answer to that is not at all. There are so many aspects of my identity that I do not see when I look at the executives. So that's my only reflection too. Yes, there may be two elements. They may be white and they may be male, but I'm much more complex than that. So that's, you know.
Agree. I think we're missing the point. We're missing the point. The panel is not representative. We're in the middle of London. Are you telling me you could not find a black speaker in the middle of London? And I think that's the challenge really that I'm putting here. And it's not your fault, I know that. But, you know, if we are really going to make a difference, surely, we can find more creative ways to do what we want to do and to send a really powerful signal about this is how the world can be.
Great.
I was just going to say, you started off talking about bravery, and I think it was really brave of you to make those points, actually, within the conference. And I do agree that regardless of your different diversities, it doesn't change the fact that there isn't a black person there on the panel. But the other issue I wanted to say as well, in terms of quotas, you talked about the fact that you might feel compromised if somebody was saying that because you're a woman, that's why you've got your job. And I think that as a black woman and speaking to other black women, if we were paid £1 every time somebody said, you're in that job because you're black, I think that in itself would solve the gender pay gap.
I know there's someone at the back who's keen to ask a question. I think there's also when, if you're out about maybe an invisible disability, and there's a sense when people, if you're open and vocal about it, when people can equally say, well, it's because of X, Y, Z. And I suppose, I think you're right. There's so many times when I will talk to people, I'll do focus groups, and often, when doing focus groups, quite often it is white British men who will say, you know what, it's not fair because I'm underrepresented. No one is speaking up for me as the white British male. Now, there are wider issues in terms of if you look at schooling and in terms of people who are opting out of society, levels of unemployment, I mean, it's huge. It's not a simple issue. But I think the element is, I think sometimes when we start looking about inclusion and diversity, we need to slightly think broader than ourselves and broader than our own biases. I'm aware there are some elements of diversity which I have no idea about. I want to find out more, but the only way I'm going to find out more is by asking people and talking about what are the barriers that you're facing that I might not be aware of, so that we can actually start to overcome it. I can voice things about which I've experienced, but I can't necessarily vocalise other people, and I don't think actually there's any sense where we can vocalise everybody's opinions.
So I just want to say two quick things. Firstly, answer your first question, evidence. That's what really makes a difference. And secondly, why don't you come and join us at the panel now? Come on then. Okay. Come on.
Can we just get you to say your name?
Sorted.
I've got to say who I am now.
If you don't mind.
I was preferring to stay anonymous. My name's Tracie Jolliff. I'm the Head of Inclusion and Systems Leadership at the NHS Leadership Academy.
Great, thank you. You hold on to that because you're not mic'd. Thanks. We had a question in the back.
Yes, thank you. My name's Lawrence Goldborn. I work at London South Bank University. So very quickly, in terms of the last interaction, Arun, well done, and Tracie, welcome. I just wanted to try to kind of ask about the ethics of pay for senior managers around diversity. Because to me, there seems to be a perverse incentive here. In as much as organisations, and I've worked in both the private and public sector, as well as the charitable sector, seem to be rewarding people at the top of businesses who should be doing their job in any case in terms of diversity. And even if you just move away from the moral and the legal case, just about the talent case. And I just wanted to find out what the panelists' view are about the ethics of remunerating further senior managers around diversity.
Anybody want to take that?
Shall I kick it off? Do you want to kick it off?
That was my attempt at disruption.
Firstly, great question. So if we are talking about, which I don't think you are, highly paid D&I executives who are in that role, in the private sector there is an industry, and Dan will vouch for this, there are some extremely highly paid individuals who lead D&I in organisations, and some of them deserve that salary and some of those don't. But I agree, if there are senior managers who are doing another job, then that should be very much part and parcel of what they do, and that shouldn't acquire additional remuneration, almost like contract money, because you're doing this extra job, so we need to give you a bit on the side. For me, that doesn't feel morally right. I'm not that cognizant of that happening, actually. So in the businesses that I deal with, for sure, when I meet champions of D&I who are non-D&I people, I'm saying this qualified by the fact I don't know what their salary structure is. It doesn't appear to me that they're being paid additional sums on top.
Okay, good.
We were in a seminar earlier and talked about accountability and leaders being held to account for the degree to which their organisations are diverse and inclusive. And to my mind, it should be that money is taken away from executives if they do not deliver diversity. Because if there's a clear business case, if there's a clear moral case, surely that is a business incentive enough to say, if you can't deliver it at your level, go away and we'll employ somebody who can.
Okay. Good.
Yeah, I mean, this is quite an alien question, obviously, to us in the public sector. We don't get bonuses, unfortunately.
I will challenge that.
But we do obviously encourage chief executives and boards to reach targets, around diversity, and that might be in terms of staff, it might be in terms of patients, it might be in terms of the coverage of the service that they provide. So in that regard, I think targets in that respect are a good thing for organisations, and I think they can obviously drive improvement, and I think that's becoming more and more common now within the NHS, but I can't help you on the bonus thing, I'm afraid, sorry.
I think there is something when you're looking at performance-related pay, often it would depend on which organisation you talk to or look at, or which executives, but quite often it's a top-up. And I suppose it's, in terms of if you're using any carrot, you've got to have a stick there as well. I think it's the same if you're looking at good people management. And actually, this is what equality and inclusion is. It's good people management. And historically, organisations haven't promoted people on the basis of good people management skills. They've done them on the basis of technical skills. So what that unfortunately means is that a lot of our organisations, a lot of our employees are headed up by people who are technically very good. They might be very good at reading a spreadsheet, but they're not necessarily very good about engaging people, talking to people, including people, and actually bringing people through change. So I think if you're looking at any of the sense of performance-related pay, it's almost got to look again at some of those root causes and say, well, I think you're right, you've got to be careful about that perverse sense where they should be doing that anyway, but it's the same with leadership skills or people management, they should be doing that anyway. So any performance-related pay, it's got to be met with sanctions or performance management if they're not hitting what they should be, or they're not doing what they should be doing.
Okay. Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks. We have.
Hi, I'm Rahima and I work in the public sector. Just picking up on the point that you made, actually, we've got a new sort of, if you like, a law out where our perm sec gets sanctioned if he doesn't deliver on diversity. Now, one of the problems we have with diversity in government is that we haven't had any evidence in for a long, long time. We've collected all the evidence throughout the whole of the civil service. We've now got everything that we need. It was a qualitative survey. It's all there. And every department has got to implement their own kind of, version of it because of the culture. And I think people are running around like headless chicken because they don't know what to do. I'm finding, I've been on diversity for 15 years now, and I can say I haven't seen much change. I'm there not because I want to boil the ocean, I just want to make that difference. And being chair of the network, I'm finding that very difficult. We get a lot of champions, diversity champions. We've been allocated diversity champions for the group, diversity champion for the department. And, we're trying to get the message, but I think it hits hard for us. And what somebody said here, it's that we have been policy orientated. We don't know what it is to be people management. And a couple of years ago, they've decided, we've got to go down the people management route. And people are finding that culture change difficult. And then coming back to Cameron, I had a meeting with the Secretary of State. They invited all the groups the other day. And he actually said, Cameron has made this statement. He's very, very serious about diversity. I want you all to go away and think about how, if you've got any ideas, send it to me. And I'm thinking, nothing's happened yet. What ideas are we giving him? I mean, there's leadership from the top, fine, but when is anything going to happen? And I think, Arun, it's somebody like you who need to come into the organisation. We've got the evidence. We've got a lot of rhetoric around. We've got a perm sec who's supposed to be committed, very committed. We've got diversity champions. But how do you put all that together? How do you turn that rhetoric into reality, I think, is what we're finding difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I would strongly agree with you. And this is, at the end of the day, it's about good human resources, you're quite right. It's also about power as well. This is what we're talking about. And I know you were in the session just a moment ago with Liz. Yeah, Liz Bingham was talking about how to bring about changes. Yeah, and she was talking about, with networks, it's about accountability. Yeah, accountability up the system. And we've tried to achieve that within the NHS in a different context. So the big focus in the NHS over the last 5 or 6 years or so has been the patient. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous, yeah, but that's the focus has been on the patient because the recognition was that if anything is going to change in the health system, patients have got to make that change. They've got to be given the power to make that change. And in the same way, I think within organisations, until you get the networks and the relevant people within organisations reporting in the right way, you're not going to get that change. Yeah.
Okay. We've got a talent action plan. We've got
plenty of action plans. I can
yeah.
I can give you rooms and rooms
it's given
of.
us a lot of power in that we're allowed to ask for budgets. We're allowed to be empowered. We've got all those things, but nobody seems to know what to do with it.
Yeah.
It's whether they have the mindset. I mean, if we took the National Equality Standard and it's a brilliant tool. So if you came in and did an audit, I'm sure that most of you would have all of your policies and procedures in place. You'd all have your structures in place. You've probably all got your working groups and stuff like that. It's not really to do with structure so much, actually. I think it's to do with whether people just buy into it or not, actually. Do people genuinely think that if you spend some of your time and energy, you're going to get some rewards, whatever those rewards are? So in the private sector, it might be about productivity and profit. In the public sector, it might be about productivity and outcomes in terms of patients or students or whoever they are. And there's so many organisations where, they've got their equality schemes and this, that and the other, but when you talk to their executives, they sort of nod at you as if they're half asleep. Maybe it's just me, I don't know. But it's kind of like, seriously, you need to either wake up and believing it, and the executives in those organisations, they are the ones that ultimately have the power. They have the power to make things happen, and they can make things happen if they want to. actually. It's about commitment, it's about energy, and it's about individual and collective mindset. And I sometimes genuinely question whether those executives really want to do anything around this, or whether they just hide behind the policies and the structures, and they hide behind all sorts of stuff and say, oh, it's too complicated and this, that, or the other. Yes, of course things are complicated, but actually if you simplify them and focus on 1, 2, or 3 kind of points, you can actually drive some of this stuff forward, actually. And it'd be really fascinating in terms of the Perm Sec if he or she does not deliver, whether they will be penalised on that, because that would be an interesting model, actually.
Make a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on a couple of points there. When we're looking at the changes, I quite often when I'm talking to people, first of all, you've got to find the right hook for the organisation to really get them thinking about it. But also, when we're talking about inclusion, we're talking about people, we're talking about essentially nudging the culture, and nudging, trying to understand, breaking down some of those barriers. And first of all, there's a sense, almost a sense you've got these action plans that we've got to do something about it. We've almost got to understand the why and the root causes before we can put anything in place. And when we're putting things in place, it's not going to be one magic wand. I think you're right, we've got to look at a couple of actions, because if you do a scattergun approach, you're not really going to hit many things. But it's about trying to nudge and shift things. I've seen some great work with some engineering companies going into, they realised that the pipeline for talent wasn't great. So rather than saying, oh, it's because women don't, want to go into it, they understood that actually they were being turned off really early in terms of in school. So they actually actively went into schools to understand what was going on, trying to essentially highlight what people could do. And that was one intervention. Another university essentially understood that women weren't going for a particular academic role because one of the criteria was international conferences. And that was actually seen to be quite an outdated element in terms of the academic circles of today, and saying actually television appearances or engagement with the public wasn't being cited to the same extent. And actually, as soon as you made that point and that comment to a senior stakeholder to say, actually, as soon as you've got any caring responsibilities, it's very difficult to do an international conference. Or it's very difficult to go to an after-work networking event where it's very boozy and you don't know if there's going to be someone there. I mean, straight away, quite a lot will be alcohol-based. So if you don't drink, you are excluded. So in some ways, it's almost those actions which are really small can make a big difference, because it's all about the little nudges, all about opening up those barriers, I suppose.
Micro-inequities, we call it, don't we?
Yeah. I think that we need to draw this to a close. I think this has been a great panel. Thank you for joining us. And thank you to Arun for that. I'm a lecturer and I love teaching, and everything that we've been talking about, whatever area you work in, I think opening these conversations in informal or informal settings is what we need to be pushing for. One of my identities is also a mother. I have 2 little boys, they're 6 and 3, and they love to read the story The Lorax, and I'll just end with a quote from that, which is, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. So thank you very much for coming. Today is also the United Nations International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls. My colleague here brought that to my attention, and I just wanted to tell everybody that this starts 16 days of action, which ends on the 10th of December, which is also Human Rights Day. So if you want to do something, go out and spread the word around that and tweet about it, maybe. It's been lovely to hear many of you, and next year we will be holding the same conference, and we'll be talking about the panel and opening up that discussion. Thank you very much.